Before the lecture, I would now like to call upon Professor Dr. Apinan Posianon, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Culture, member of Bangkok Art and Culture Center Foundation Executive Board, and member of Asian Art Council Solomon Guggenheim Museum. If for some of you who's standing, we have the live streaming downstairs. If you wish to go and see live streaming downstairs, so please welcome Professor Dr. Apinan for an introduction. Thank you.
เรียนท่านกรรมการมูลนิธิหอศิลปวัฒนธรรมแห่งกรุงเทพมหานครนะครับท่านผู้มีเกียรติท่านศิลปินท่านสื่อมวลชนที่เคารพรักยิ่งขอบคุณที่มาสร้างประวัติศาสตร์ในวันนี้นะครับคงไม่เห็นบ่อยครั้งนักนะครับที่เราจะเห็นกลุ่มศิลปินและนักคิดสร้างสรรค์ในพื้นที่เดียวกันอย่างวันนี้โครงการที่ได้จัดขึ้นในช่วง4 วันนะครับเป็นโครงการที่ได้มีการวางแผนและพูดถึงกันมา7 ปีแล้วเมื่อวันที่20 กุมภาพันธ์ 2550 1 ปีหลังจากการปฏิวัติทาง Guggenheim Museum นิวยอร์กได้เชิญให้ผมไปบรรยายพิเศษที่นครนิวยอร์กในเลคเชอร์ของฮิลลาโรเบย์นะครับเขาจะเป็นเลคเชอร์ที่เขาเชิญนักวิชาการไปพูดทุกปีในปีนั้นผมได้บรรยายในหัวข้อที่ชื่อว่า Titanic Thai Art in the Age of Constraints and Coercion ในการบรรยายวันนั้นเนี่ยนะครับก็ได้มีการพูดถึงวงการศิลปะหลังปฏิวัติ1 ปีแล้วก็ได้มีการพูดถึงว่าจะทำยังไงให้กลุ่มของนักวิชาการแล้วนักคิดสร้างสรรค์ของ Guggenheim เนี่ยมาจัดสัมมนาที่กรุงเทพแล้วเมื่อวานนี้ได้เกิดขึ้นจริงนะครับหลัง7 ปีแต่ได้มีการปฏิวัติอีกครั้งหนึ่งเมื่อเช้าผมรายงานเรื่องนี้ให้กับนายกรัฐมนตรีบ่งเห็นถึงว่ากรุงเทพมหานครพร้อมที่จะมีงานสำคัญและใหญ่อย่างนี้บ่งบอกถึงความมั่นใจนะครับของต่างชาติอยากจะเรียนว่าสมาชิกของทางโซโลมอนกรุ๊ปไฮม์ของ Art Asian Council เนี่ยมีมาจากหลายประเทศนะครับ10 กว่าประเทศในวันนี้แล้วก็นั่งอยู่ในห้องนี้ด้วยจากออสเตรเลียจากอินโดนีเซียฟิลิปปินส์จากอิตาลีนะครับและจากอีกหลากหลายประเทศเพราะฉะนั้นต้องขอบคุณนะครับทางหอกทมนะครับหอศิลปวัฒนธรรมแห่งกรุงเทพรวมไปถึงผู้ที่ให้การสนับสนุนนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นทางคุณเพชรโอสานุเคราะห์นะครับโดยเฉพาะทางคุณอภิรักษ์โกษโยธินนะครับรวมไปถึงคุณบุญชัยเบญจรงกุลนะครับคุณเสริมคุณาวงศ์คุณชราทิพย์จูตระกูลนะครับแล้วอีกหลายท่านก็หวังเป็นอย่างยิ่งว่าท่านคงจะเพลิดเพลินสนุกสนานและได้องค์ความรู้จากการบรรยายในวันนี้นะครับในนามของกระทรวงวัฒนธรรมก็ขอขอบคุณทุกท่านเป็นอย่างยิ่งนะครับแล้วก็ขอบคุณทางคุณริชาร์ด อาร์มสตรองคุณอเล็กซานเดอร์ มันโรและตัวแทนของทางพิพิธภัณฑ์โซโลมอน กูเกิลไฮม์ต่อไปขออนุญาตพูดเป็นอีกภาษาหนึ่งนะครับ Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great delight and pleasure for you to be here, and especially our visitors from the Guggenheim Museum. The Asian Art Council, Guggenheim, has been extremely active and had the chance to give the lecture in 2007, 1 year after the coup d'etat, on the subject Titanic, Thai Art in the Age of Coercion and Constraints. At that time we had discussion and I talked to Alexandra whether it would be possible to dare think to have such a meeting in Bangkok. Over the years, we discussed, and finally, yesterday, it really happened. But also, what happened in Thailand was another coup on 27th of June. Nevertheless, I'd like to emphasize that culture has no boundaries. It is also apolitical. And I want to reassure you that over the plans of the coming of the event here, Guggenheim always has stressed that they would come. So in that way, I just want to stress and thank Richard Armstrong, Alexander Monroe, and all the colleagues of the Solomon Guggenheim to come and be here. But I think this historical event shows that Guggenheim has much interest about Thai art and Southeast Asian art. And the symposium over the 4 years will be most invigorating and exhilarating. And I hope very much that the atmosphere, the ambience here, and the welcoming will give them the chance and opportunity to work with Thai artists. Already upstairs on the 8th floor, the atmosphere among the artists and the people from the art world was very refreshing, and I hope very much that there will be activities related to Thai art with the Guggenheim in the near future. So I just want to thank all the patrons, I already mentioned in Thai, who have contributed this event possible. So on the behalf of the Ministry of Culture, I like to welcome you again, and I hope very much that the lecture by Richard Armstrong today will be most memorable and delightful. So please welcome Richard Armstrong.
Thank you, Apinam, and thank you for your long interest in the Guggenheim and in Asian art. I understood on arrival yesterday this is the country of smiles, and tonight I see it's a country of great patience also. Thank you for waiting for so long, but there was a mix-up in the image gods. And I'll show you 3 sets of information, I hope, and then we can ask each other questions. At the beginning, I thought it was good if you saw the origins of the Guggenheim and what its original aspirations were. In the middle, I show you information about its commitment to Asian art. At the end, I talk about this idea of the constellation because we now feel strongly that as a global institution, there are not only great opportunities, but great responsibilities as well. You're looking at the Guggenheim in New York. You didn't realize that it was waterfront property. This is the reservoir in Central Park. The curved building, built in 1959, opened in 1959, designed by Lloyd Wright, and then a building behind it, which is upright and was in the original plan, but not realized until 1991 by my successor. That is the small and should be familiar Guggenheim, because upstairs I have some feeling of the same ideas. Here is the original collector. I complimented the architect. Here is the original collector who was from a very wealthy family. He was in the unusual position of not only taking ore out of the earth, but also smelting it. So it was a kind of monopoly. At one moment, the family controlled most of the copper in the world. His name is Solomon Robert Guggenheim. He's one of 7 brothers. This is number 4. So the child psychologists among you probably know that in that position you have to be a conciliator, and he was. And he represented the company called Guggenheim Partners and later Guggenex and other names in North America and South America, which was where the principal operations were. He and his brothers each married even wealthier women, always a good strategy. This family had come from Switzerland but wound up in Philadelphia in 1848. After they began making money, they had to leave Philadelphia and come to New York, which seems to be also true. He married into a well-known family in New York, but he and his wife, who I'm sure she was a very nice person, honestly had not very good taste, and they bought a lot of paintings which today are probably mostly forgotten, mostly by French artists. However, in the 1920s, his wife engaged this ebullient German emigre to paint Mr. Guggenheim's portrait. This is a woman called Hilla Rebay. She had trained as an artist in Germany, principally in Munich, but she was also familiar with artists who had been allied with the Bauhaus school. And her own taste was very much a fusion of German expressionism and very severe abstraction. In fact, in the end, she only believed in a certain kind of painting, which she called non-objective painting. However, at the beginning, she made a representational picture, which was a portrait of Mr. Guggenheim. And as they sat and worked together, she convinced him that everything he had done up to age 63 in terms of collecting was worthless, and he should begin again. So she's quite a persuasive person, a great attribute for a museum director. She's from a Prussian family, but essentially lived outside of Prussia, and came to America in the late 1920s with the idea that she would make her way as an artist. And she practiced as an artist the rest of her life, even while she helped the Guggenheims, because ultimately it was Mr. and Mrs. Guggenheim, make a very big collection of art that she felt strongly about. They lived at a fake chateau on the North Shore of Long Island, as did many wealthy New Yorkers, but they kept an apartment at the Plaza Hotel. And in that apartment, beginning in the 1930s, they would invite people on Tuesday to come see the collection. And I'm showing you one of their bedrooms, adorned with paintings which are in the collection today of varying value, culturally and economically. But after a few years of having strangers in their bedroom, in their dining room, in their living room in the Plaza Hotel, they decided in 1939 to make a foundation and to open a museum. And you can see that it's a museum because there's a neon sign on the right that says museum. This is at 24 East 54th Street in Manhattan, so not far from where the Museum of Modern Art is today. And that's an interesting moment in New York, and it might be applicable here in Bangkok. At one moment in New York, a group of very powerful women, Hilla Rebay for the Guggenheims, Mrs. Rockefeller for the Museum of Modern Art, and Mrs. Whitney for the Whitney Museum, decided that the city needed the proper museums, and they founded and ran those museums for many years. So this had been a car showroom. It was redecorated by a German architect in a peculiar fashion. And Mrs. Rebay had very unusual ideas about the best way to see art. Not only the art, but also the best way. So here we're looking at pictures on walls that have velvet on them, pleated velvet. You might notice that the pictures seem a little low, and that was her idea also. That the painting should have a very big frame around it for various weird philosophical reasons. And finally, that not only could you sit and look at the picture, but you were encouraged to lie down. Actually, I think that's not such a bad idea. The part that might have been offensive was that these pictures were lighted with fluorescent lights, which was quite radical at that moment. And even more interesting, or possibly more offensive, she had piped in music by Bach. So it's meant to be an all-encompassing experience from her direction, of course, and from that, you would go away as a changed person. This is the part that I think is applicable to the museum even today, and I say to its trustees and staff, our job is to be as radical today as we were in 1939, and that's really our responsibility and our possibility. She believed, and this was a slight perversion of Bauhaus ideas, that by looking at abstract painting, people's behavior could be changed. And as you may know, and this is my private interpretation of Bauhaus, I think it has two motivations in a way that people don't talk about often. One is that people be healthy, because at that moment, tuberculosis was still a tremendous scourge. And the other motivation is that people become simpler, happier, and more connected with one another through a universal language. So that's the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, as it was known, from 1939 until 1949. During the 1940s, Mrs. Rebay had written to Frank Lloyd Wright saying that she, even though she wasn't the patron but only the director, she wanted Wright to build a temple for art. So the family began looking for possible properties, and Wright's idea was that the museum be up the river on the west side so that you would be obliged to drive your car to the museum. He was obsessed with automobiles. And he also thought that all spiritual buildings should be on hills, and he chose a site up on the river. The family was not interested in that. Eventually, they found this property on Fifth Avenue, 2 apartment buildings, and then you see an empty lot on the left side. And that became the site and is today the address of the museum, 1071 Fifth Avenue. For 5 years, that apartment building served as the museum. It was demolished, and for the next 6 years, this building, and here are the 3 happy people behind it, was under construction. So that's Frank Lloyd Wright holding his hat, literally and metaphorically. Mrs. Rebay in the middle, who seems very delighted, and Mr. Guggenheim, who may or may not have been so happy. One thing I should say about Frank Lloyd Wright, which is not untrue, and I can say this because I lived in Pittsburgh previously, where he made the great building called Falling Water. But every decade, he found an extremely rich family, and then he milked that family for at least 10 years. So the Kaufmans, after they built Falling Water, were finished with him. They, in fact, were afraid of him. And he moved on to the Guggenheim family, and this process really took almost 60 iterations of the museum before it's built. The drawing is, I mean, this model is peculiar because it's not the way the museum was realized, but one thing that might be interesting to think about is that you were allowed to drive into the building for the first year it was open. And that's why there's an opening on Fifth Avenue. Today, this is the gift shop, but previously it was for people to drive into the museum. And that shows the cars going into the museum, as they did for a while. Here, and you know then, if you came to the museum until fairly recently, it was a difficult place to present art. All of the walls are crooked. The floor is slanted. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted no electric lights. Thank God the second director convinced him that there had to be lights in the building. But it's still a very peculiar place that only, I would say, in the last 25 years has the museum understood well how to present art in this environment. And now I would say with great confidence that you go there and you know that whatever it is you see, you'll not only enjoy, but remember, which is a great attribute for a museum. And I'm showing to you this last large-scale installation by the American artist Dan Flavin. During the 1960s, the museum began to change from its focus exclusively on Europe and North America to a bigger worldview, and it even began a series of exhibitions called the Guggenheim International. And I wanted to show this very first demonstration of Onkawara's radical work shown in 1971. And to remind you that in February this year, please come back to the museum and we'll show you the entire rotunda of the museum filled with Onkawara's work. I'm sorry that it took 44 years to realize the project, but now I want to say to you that Asian art has a very integral part in the program, and I thought you might want to see some of the things that have happened just in the last 7 or 8 years, including this great show about China, the Psycho Chang installation that some people may have seen here or elsewhere as it traveled to Hong Kong, a commission from the Indian Anglo artist Anish Kapoor that we did at the same time, a show organized by Alexandra Monroe that looked at American art as it had been influenced by Asian thought and practice, called The Third Mind. That's a view of it. a large retrospective of the Korean artist Lee Ufan, which I would say marked a turning point in the museum's ability to really, I think, come to grips with an aesthetic that seemed at the beginning not to be compatible with Frank Lloyd Wright, and at the end turned out to be utterly compatible, and I think very flattering to both artists. Another view of Ufan's exhibition. An exhibition that looked at about 7 or 8 collectives and individual artists from India, organized by the young curator Sandini Podar. This is Amor Khanar's room. And more recently, another exhibition co-organized by Alexandra Monroe that examined for the first time in North America this important post-war phenomenon in Japan called Gutai, and became tremendously popular with our audience in New York for good reason. And then finally, through our sponsorship from UBS, we were able to put together a collection of South and Southeast Asian artists, including 3 from Thailand. I think you see a painting here you probably recognize by Naveen. And this show was in New York, then went to Hong Kong, and was ultimately presented in Singapore at the new Contemporary Center there. So those are things that have happened in the last 6.5 years that I think demonstrate the museum has a very deep connection now to the achievements of Asia. In October, we will have the first and I think breathtaking retrospective of the great Indian painter V.S. Gaitonde, followed by a commission by the Chinese artist Wan Zhanwei, and an exhibition of the Iranian sculptor Monir also next year. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about this idea of constellation. Previously, we talked about other museums at other sites as affiliates, which sounded quite clinical and overly commercial. Now we talk about our being connected as a kind of constellation so that each star can shine brightly at a different moment, perhaps. You may know that in 1979, Peggy Guggenheim, the niece of Solomon Guggenheim, had died, and she left her villa on the Grand Canal, which we see lighted up in the middle in white, to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation with her unbelievable collection, principally of surrealist, but also of some abstract expressionist work, now given to the foundation in New York and available to the public. So 1939, we began as a public institution in New York. 1979, a public institution in Venice. So this is called Peggy Guggenheim Collection. It attracts about 500,000 people a year. I thought you might be interested to see that she was mildly eccentric. Here she is in her sitting room with one of her many dogs, and a demonstration of her wide interest in not only primitive art, but also advanced European and American art. 1979. Then in the 1990s, leadership from Bilbao, an industrial city in northern Spain, came to New York and spoke to my predecessor about rehabilitating an existing building in Bilbao, a factory building, with the idea of its being a contemporary art center in this relatively small city. And as I said to you before, I lived in Pittsburgh, and that might be the closest counterpart, at least in the West, to steel manufacturing cities who suffered because steel manufacturing went to other places and techniques changed. So the leadership said, yes, let's build a building. My predecessor said, we're not renovating an existing factory building. We will build a new building on this river, which at that moment was still highly polluted. And from that came this incredible building by Frank Gehry, I think typically considered one of the 2 or 3 great buildings of the period 1950 to our time. Today, attracting about 1 million people, to a city of 1 million, but more importantly, for the people who live in the city and the region, it's become a demonstration of their shared value and their worthiness towards one another. I think it's gone from being, and here I show it under construction, an introverted and slightly damaged place to an extroverted and very modern, happy place. So when you read about the Bilbao effect, it's this idea that you can change your city through intense cultural investment. Very unusual and large spaces that have originally, I think, were not particularly conducive to contemporary art, and now I think through clever use of the space, this place looks like it is predicting a new space for the world at large. You may know of this giant steel installation by Richard Serra called A Matter of Time, which is several hundred yards long and is perfect for this site in using the material that was once fabricated in Bilbao, this kind of steel, and I think serves as a beautiful monument to this common effort of reasserting the value of art museums and high culture in contemporary society. So that's Bilbao. I wanted also to tell you that occasionally we are involved in smaller buildings, and sometimes they're even portable buildings. This was a project that we did 2 years ago in New York, in Berlin, and in Mumbai, of inviting a great Japanese firm, Atelier Bow Wow, to build a temporary building that would allow people to come on an unscheduled basis and involve themselves in hundreds and hundreds of programs about the meaning of architecture inside today's city. So this was meant to be only for 11 weeks. It attracted about 170,000 people in New York, basically was open about 14 hours a day. I think it proved to be a very challenging operation for museums, since temperamentally and psychologically we're usually a little slower than society. This forced us to be on the same pace as society. And then when we took the building in a different form but with some of the same attributes to Mumbai, it became even more challenging because the audience was very different, very inquisitive, and incredibly appreciative of the opportunity to talk about. The topic there was, what is the role of privacy in the new city? So these are demonstrations of our interest in being temporarily involved with the place as well. Then finally, the place that you hear about often, which I inherited from Tom Krenz and have now grown to recognize as a super opportunity, not only for us, but I hope for a big audience, including many people from Thailand if you go to the Gulf. Here you see what had previously been a 21-mile-long uninhabited island called Saadiyat. When does it? We don't open a museum in Bangkok. We will visit Bangkok. So this shows the Guggenheim, the Louvre, and what will be a British museum, as well as a performing arts center, in a new construction that's meant to be home to about 350,000 people. So as recently as 4 years ago, uninhabited, with no bridge to the mainland, now completely set up for a very new kind of construction where culture actually serves as a magnet to a place rather than golf courses. And here is the most recent drawing and construction of the building. It's 580,000 square feet in feet, so quite large. It's more than 20 stories high, but only has 4 levels for art. And we're hoping to attract about 3 million visitors a year to this site. We, today, with the Asian Art Council, the curator, one of the curators, shared some of the collection, which we put together very consciously in the idea that we have a collection that demonstrates vitality and creativity from around the world, and we hope in a new way. And there are Thai artists already in that collection, and there'll be others, I can promise you. It's a very big challenge. Probably you've heard about the disputes of working conditions for the laborers who are on the site. Today we have no construction at the Guggenheim, however the Louvre is being built, and we're in daily contact with the leadership in UAE to the degree we can control, guarantee that everyone who works at this site has respect, has dignity, has his passport, is properly paid, and is sent home after his 2-year period with life and limb intact and a good payment as well. It's difficult, I think, for us in the West and possibly for you also to realize that these kinds of exploitations of other humans are not good for anyone. And we feel particularly keen that the museum, with our allies, can help reform this abuse. We want you to come to the museum, but we want you to know that the museum was built by people who themselves can come to the museum because they have a proper salary and they are treated correctly. So this museum should be opening in 2017. If you go to Abu Dhabi before, the Louvre opens in 2015. We have no museum in Bangkok, but I hope we have very many friends in Bangkok in the future, and I'd happily answer any questions if I could. Thank you. Let me also recommend, if you haven't seen upstairs, the exhibition on the 8th floor. It's quite persuasive. I think it shows a broad range of creativity. My congratulations to its curator. And one of the hardest things to do today, I think, is to juxtapose classical or older work with contemporary work and make it seem that they have a kind of parody, and that happens very elegantly upstairs. Questions? Yes. Yeah, sorry, this is another Frank Gehry building. Yeah. So he will be far along in his career when it's finished, but most of the drawings are completely finished, and we feel comfortable about oversight and also engineering also. But it's Frank Gehry, yes. I think there's no formula. I think that it's particular to your place, and my encouragement would be that everyone who's interested in the subject stay together, and the more people be persuaded that it's the correct way to make the investment. One of the reasons there's so many museums in America is that it's, in America, a very socially acceptable practice to buy things, especially new things now, put them on the wall and then give them away, but that's not always true elsewhere. But I think we could demonstrate both. We had a collection, and from that came a Frank Lloyd Wright building. But today we have a collection in Abu Dhabi with no building. There will be a building someday. But I think either way can happen, and I would encourage you to stay united to make sure that the leadership of the country understands the value doing it either direction. Yes. I'm coming upstairs. Another question? Yes.
Chuck Satilla. Chuck Satilla. I was wondering if you could give us an update on the development within the Constellation of the project in Helsinki. I understand the first stage of the architectural competition has ended, and you've received 1,715 submissions, which is extraordinary, but tremendous amount of work. And I guess the second part of that question is, who's actually funding this first round of work and planning on the Helsinki project?
Yeah. So we were almost every week, a very interesting group of people comes from somewhere, including Ulaanbaatar, whom I found tremendously attractive. And they're interested in that Bilbao effect being alive in their city or their country or their county. But the Guggenheim, in fact, is a very small place with not so much yeast, so we have to be careful we can't make bread everywhere. However, the leadership of Helsinki came 4 years ago, and it seemed to me that they had very strong, stable political government, a very open society. The population, in my opinion, was underserved with art, and the city deserved a larger number of tourists and also a bigger place in the cultural map. And I must say also that geopolitically it offers itself perfectly as an entry to Petersburg, which is very nearby and uniquely cultural. So we made an agreement to try and make a museum, and we lost by 1 vote in the city council 2 years ago on May 18. Then my feeling was that in such an open society we should have further debate, and they agreed. And then we were encouraged to have this competition, and it began in June. It ended last week. We had 1,715 architects submit, and we think that's historically the biggest competition in the history of the world, although we don't like to use hyperbole very often. It's an expensive process, and the Guggenheim Foundation is paying for it. Yeah. I promise I'm coming. One more question. So what the equation in Finland, if it happens, because there'll be another vote, would be a large private investment, probably investment from the national government, and investment from the city as well. And as you may know, we were given permission for 1 year to reserve a very powerful site on the old harbor that looks back to the neoclassical city. So we have a beautiful site, and one of the charms of Finland is recognizing the role of water in people's lives. So we particularly want to be on the water, and it's a very good place, I think. Now it's up to the jury to find 6 possible candidates for the project, and then later to choose one of those. But that should be by June next year. Yes? No? I think that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions privately, and then perhaps you can go with me to the 9th floor and we can see this artist work. Thanks very much.